We welcome you to our evening service again this evening and our final installment in our study of Job, at least for now, anyway. And so Job chapter 42, I'm just going to plan to read one verse to you at this point anyway. We'll probably look at some others. But Job 42 and verse number 10. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. That verse right there sort of sums it all up. That's what we're looking for. That's what we've been waiting for all this time as we've looked through Job. And there have been low points. Of course, we started actually pretty good, and then all the low points, and finally it seemed like this is what we've been waiting on, is when God finally brings it back around. And so this evening we want to focus on that a little bit. I think verse number 10 sort of sums it all up pretty well. And the basic idea of it all is that God delivered him. And so that's kind of our theme for tonight as we bring it to a close. The final chapter says God delivers again. And of course, obviously there's been so much going on. Job has suffered for so long, and we focused some on his depression. We may mention that again a little bit later on. But God had not forgotten him. And he finally ended up coming through in a marvelous way. And again, our text verse just kind of sums that up so well. But before we focus on that part, and of course, basically verse 9, verse 10, and then on through the rest of the chapter is just those few verses that tell us the rest of the story and what really makes so much of the difference in it all. But before we get to that, let's go back just a little bit in the chapter. And maybe we'll focus just for a little bit there on verse 5. Just take a look at that. I want to touch on these before we get to the main part of the message this evening, so don't get confused. We're just kind of touching some highlights here. But verse number 5, notice how he says, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear. And many of us could say that along with Job. We would say, yeah, I've heard a lot about him. I've heard about how he can come through for his children, and he can supply the needs, and he can answer prayer and all those things. I've heard those things before. And Job apparently had. But notice what else he says. But now mine eye seeth thee. So really what he's saying, there's two senses right here. And I would maybe tie that in with, I believe it's Psalm 34, where he says, and oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. So you've got three senses right there. And in a sense, maybe we would say, well, what is that really? What's the point of it all? I hear, I see, I taste. Well, the idea of it is you can hear a lot about God. You can hear a lot about what He'll do. But there comes a point where you have to experience it for yourself. Not just hearing about it. But this is what I've seen. This is what I've enjoyed myself. Tasted, as the psalmist says. And so tonight, maybe we could just be reminded that we have to get to the point where not just that I've heard these things, but now I've sensed God meet my need. God, I have sensed God revive my spirit and bring me through this trial. And so Job is able to say, I've not only heard it now, but I've also seen it with my own eyes. And then you go down to verses 7 and 8. And we also see a little phrase that I want to draw your attention to. We started off with it pretty well. If you remember what we were focusing on, the very first chapter of Job, what did God say to the devil? He said, hast thou considered my servant Job? 4 times in these two verses here, verses 7 and 8, God again, at the end of the story, the last chapter, God says, my servant Job. Let me just share that with you here quickly. He's speaking to the 3 friends, particularly to Eliphaz, and then he mentions thy 2 friends. So it's the 3 of them together. And he says, my wrath is kindled against thee and against thy 2 friends, for ye have not spoken of me that the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. Then you go to verse number 8, and you find it 3 times. Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept, lest I deal with you after your folly, in that ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. God had not forgotten about Job. And even though the three friends, for I guess the bulk of Job, of the book of Job, would probably have not agreed with God's assessment. You're not God's servant anymore. It's very obvious. You're somehow way out in left field. You got to repent. You got to come back. And yet God, through it all, He comes right back here and He says, you fellas that have been the accusers, Job's my servant. And you have not pleased me like he does. And so just a good reminder there that God was making it very clear. You're not as righteous as you think you are. And the man you thought was wicked is more righteous than you. And He instructs them to go to Job for sacrifice and prayer. What a turnaround that is. It's just almost comical in a way how God is just setting the record straight right there. Obviously, we know He will one day in heaven or at the judgment, but He was right there. He's saying, you fellas need prayer, and I want Job to pray for you. I'll listen to him. I won't even hear your, well, he doesn't maybe say it quite that way, but basically, I'm not even going to listen to you. I won't hear your prayer, but I will hear my servant Job when he prays. And that kind of brings us then to the main focus here this evening as we get into verses 9 and 10 and then the following ones as well. And kind of the rest of the message tonight, I'd like to focus a little bit about this. Yeah, we could focus on Job. We've done that a lot already in this, or somewhat at least in this book. Obviously, it's about him. But yet, really, this last chapter it's partly about Job, but it's also about God. It's about God coming through. God delivering again. God bringing him to the point of victory. And so I want to focus a little bit on His plan, but maybe just kind of get started on that. I read a story about a pilot who was actually airborne, apparently. He was up in the air, but he was just preparing to land. But as I don't know if he had come from another area or whatever, but he had gotten to the airport, and it come to find out there's fog just shrouding the airport. He's apparently familiar with it. I don't know if it was his home airport or not, but he's familiar with it a little bit. But he calls in for help, and the controllers there, the traffic controllers, they decided, well, we're just going to bring him in by instruments or whatever. We have him on the screen, and we'll tell him where to go and where to turn and all those things, and we'll guide him in. And as he began receiving those directions from the ground, he suddenly remembered, as I mentioned, he knew that airport, and he remembered there is a particular high pole that sticks up right in my flight path. And I'm afraid I'm going to hit it. And so he calls up to them, and he just kind of in a panic, he says, don't forget, there's that tall pole right there on my path. And they responded with something like this. Now I want you to remember this, and maybe take it as your motto, as though from God. You obey instructions, we'll take care of obstructions. Let me say that one more time. Let me make sure you get this. You obey instructions, we'll take care of obstructions. Obviously, Job was going through a really hard time of obstructions like you and I have never seen. Hopefully, we never will. But Job's duty was not to have it all solved and to get in a panic. It's just simply obey instructions. God will take care of the obstructions. God will set the record straight. God will come through. And so thank God we have this final chapter, Job 42, that reminds us God delivers again. Let's look at several aspects to that. First of all, we've noticed what I'm calling God's emancipation. God comes through with emancipation. Obviously, that takes us back to earlier times of our history, and we think of the slave market or those that had been in bondage for years maybe, and finally there was that emancipation proclamation, and the slaves are set free. All that was involved, and you can imagine the rejoicing. But God does that for each and every one of us in some measure or another, and He did that for Job. Notice the first few words of verse 10. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job. The Lord turned the captivity of Job. that word there can even kind of give the idea of exile, the captivity, the exile. He's been, in a sense, you might say, he's been in a foreign land. He's been bound. He's been struggling through this as the devil has afflicted him over and over and over again. He's an awful taskmaster. And by the way, he still is. You don't want to get into the clutches of Satan. God pulled back that protection on Job for a while, and Satan had his chance. Job was in exile, and it pretty properly describes the situation that Job found himself when we say captivity. The captivity of Job, the exile of Job. He was held in bondage to Satan's awful schemes against his character. Satan is determined to destroy him spiritually. But right here, we read that God turned that around. You know, somebody found some comfort, and yeah, it's misappropriated. I know it's not quite what Scripture meant initially, but maybe it'd be good for us just to remember once in a while. They took that little phrase, we find it over and over in the Scripture, and it came to pass. The idea of that, supposed to be normally, is just in the course of time. It happened. But sometimes it might be good to kind of reappropriate that as someone has done and recognize that whatever comes to us comes to pass eventually. God will bring us through this time. No matter what the thorn in our flesh or our captivity of the enemy may be, we can be sure that God can turn it around. And eventually, if we'll hold on, He will. He can unchain us from the heartaches and pain that bind us, and He can set us free to rejoice. He wants to set us free. I don't know what all you may be going through this evening, but I'm here to tell you, God has deliverance for you. He is the great emancipator. He is able to set us free. But there's another aspect to that if we keep reading in verse number 10. Yes, the Lord turned the captivity of Job, and we rejoice in that. And there's more to rejoice about even just a little bit, but just the next step, though, is not exactly the same flavor. Notice what else he says. The Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. And so we better not jump ahead. We don't do ourselves a service if we fail to recognize that. There was an obligation here. God had an expectation for Job. Again, we might just prefer to rush on to the blessings, but God did all this when he prayed for his friends. And friends maybe ought to be in quotes. His accusers really is what it turned out to be. All the frustration Job had faced, all the things that were going wrong in his life, and finally it came down. God puts his finger on Job. Job, would you pray for these guys? Are you willing to pray that God will, or that I will forgive them? Are you willing to step in and be their intercessor? Even though they accused you? Even though it doesn't seem fair? Are you willing to do that? Wow. God's expectation. Job had been rightly frustrated in my eyes. I think he deserved to be a little frustrated. These guys are falsely accusing him. But God had already told them, you go to Job so that he could pray for you. I'll listen to him. But now he puts it in Job's lap. Are you willing to pray for them? And when Job prayed for his three, we'll call them comrades right now, maybe not exactly friends, although I suppose it came back around and he forgave them. But then God showed mercy on his state. The Lord turned the captivity of Job. He flipped it all around when Job prayed for his friends. Let me just touch on something here quickly before we move on. No matter how justified we feel sometimes in giving someone the cold shoulder because of what we feel like has been mistreatment or false accusations or whatever else it may be, some misunderstanding, we must not forget that God's greatest blessings are showered on those who will truly respond like Job did here. Those who are willing to pray for an enemy. Those who are willing to step in and be an intercessor for somebody that really doesn't deserve our prayers. If we're just thinking about in the human side. But Job prayed for his enemies, if I could even go that strongly. I know they're called friends. But in this particular case, they had been sort of an enemy. I mean, it'd be better for him not to have heard from anybody than to hear what they were giving. And so, in a sense, maybe we'd even say enemy. And yet Job was willing to pray for them. And maybe you and I need to just kind of think about that a little bit. And sometimes we just need to take the high road. Let God work things out. Let God pour out whatever blessing or curses or whatever you want to call it, however God sees fit to bring judgment. Let's let Him do that. Just take the high road and let God work out those details of your pain and frustration. I want you to think about this one thought here. It doesn't have to be easy. Nobody necessarily said it would be, right? It doesn't have to be easy. It just has to be right. Let me say that again. It doesn't have to be easy. It just has to be right. When God asks us to intercede, to pray for those who we feel like have mistreated us, God expects us to respond with grace and take the high road and do the right thing. God has some expectations for us. And sometimes we might say, "Oh Lord, please deliver me." But what about whenever He says, could you do this first? Would you respond rightly in this particular case? Would you offer my forgiveness maybe, my grace? Will you offer that to this one who has mistreated you? God had expectations for Job, and when he responded appropriately, then God turned the captivity of Job. Now we get to one more aspect that I want to notice with you, and that's the last part of the verse. And then we're going to look at some other little bit here as well, I believe. But let's look at the last part of the verse. Also, almost like this is just kind of thrown in extra. Just let's just finish off the story. Also, the Lord gave him twice as much as he had before. That's what we've been waiting on anyway, right? I mean, if you know the story, that's what we kind of are waiting on. But it just kind of throws it in almost like it's an afterthought. Also, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. And then it goes on and tells us about it, what all he had. Now, the one exception would be his children. He had the same number of children restored to him, but then double of the herds and cattle and various things. So he had all of that given to him, and I'd like to call that God's extravagance. We had God's emancipation, and then God's expectation, but then I want to just finish up this whole study with God's extravagance. I know for a long time, we're at chapter 42. For 40 chapters anyway, we might say, it doesn't look like there's very much extravagance on God's part. But He finally comes through in the end. Obviously, God's doing what's the best to begin with, but at the very end, we can start reading about it. We move to the last part of this verse, and that little reminder that God just poured on the blessing. Some speculate on how that all happened. It's not really that important for us tonight. I'll mention to you one thing that I read that they thought, well, maybe whenever Job got better, he got recovered, then he gathered a band together and they went after those that had taken all his property, and they recovered it, and they also were able to spoil the enemies and take as much as his enemies had taken from him, he took back from them in addition to his own property. Who knows? I sort of doubt that, but it doesn't really matter. We don't have to worry about that. It's just sufficient to know that God came through to reward Job in the end. But I want to notice one other thing with you that I don't know that I ever really thought too much about it. But you remember back number of weeks ago now that I spoke to you a little bit about Job's depression. Job was really going through a low place. I think it was, chapter 3 or 4? Maybe both of those kind of tied together. And Job's at a very low spot. And do you remember what he said? I just wish I was dead. It would be better for me to be dead. In fact, it would be better that I'd never been born. Would you read with me verse 16? After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died, being old and full of days. Now, that might not mean very much to you, but you know what it speaks to me? Sometimes we can think that we are at the end of the road. Or if you prefer a little different analogy, we're hanging on to the end of the rope. Don't know how much longer we can hold on. We don't know how much further we can go. And we pretty well feel like my life's over with. It'll never recover. I can never really get back. Well, sometimes it might even be some past misdeeds we've done. And we just think I can never really be restored. Whatever it is, sometimes it might just be the hardship in your life. But let me just encourage you not to give up before the end of the book. Because the last 2 verses of Job tell us that finally Job died. Not when he thought he wished he would, but 140 years later. God blessed him abundantly. He saw not only his sons and daughters restored, but his sons' sons, even 4 generations. His story wasn't over. Just this past week, I believe, we heard that song sung again, a recording of that song sung at the in the IH convention. Some of you, if you watch that online, your story's not over. Don't quit before it's written. Don't quit before the end of the book. Sometimes you might think you're at the end, but you have to take an extravagant God into account. And so tonight, let me just kind of sum it up as we kind of finish off this book. What a blessing it is to read about the turnaround in Job's life. You know, God may have gotten a lot of blame through the book. I mean, at least from Job. It just felt like God wasn't coming through. God's not answering prayer. All those things. But God came through in the end, didn't He? He made Job even better than at the beginning. And so I want to just kind of close with this reminder tonight. I want you to think about this. Sort of an application for us. What you think is the worst part of your life, and maybe that you can never recover, may turn out to be when God is preparing you for even greater blessings than you've ever had before. He may be trying to give you so much more even through your pain, through your trial. But you have to wait till the end of the book. You have to stick it through and stick it out, I guess we could say, until the victory comes. Let me just remind you, you don't have to be a casualty. Even in all the pain, all the hardship, all the suffering, but you can have the victory. The key thing is, you got to stick it out until chapter 42. It may seem hard, it may seem rough, but stay in it until chapter 42, and God brings you through to abundance. We have an extravagant God who wants to bless us if we'll stay true through the trial. Well, God bless you. Keep your hand in His, and He'll bring you through.